Okay, welcome everyone. In this video, I want to talk about how we can construct an SF object, a simple feature object. So far, we've been focusing on creating geometric objects, and that's one of the key components of a simple feature. The other is data, attributes, associated with each of the geometric objects. So an SF object is a data frame that has a simple feature geometry list. So there's going to be a column in this data frame that has all of the geometry objects in there. So each entry in that column is a different geometry object. And so we work with SF objects very similar to how we work with a data frame object, though there may be some default behaviors that look that are a little bit different when we extend them to SF objects. But we can work with it just like we can with data frames. These are typically tidy, so we can use we can use tidyverse packages to do some manipulations and visualizations with an SF object. So each row in a SF object corresponds to a different geometry object. Since each entry in the geometry list column is a separate geometry object, each row of our SF object corresponds to a different geometry object. And then we're going to add some variables that attach some measurements or some characteristics to each of these geometry objects. Okay, so in practice, we're not going to really be creating SF objects ourselves from scratch. We're typically going to read in a file where this has already been created. So just like we've been working with data frames, usually we're not creating those data frames, but we're working with data frames that are in packages or that we import from other files. We're going to do the same with SF objects. We'll mostly be importing them from files that we call shape files. But I want to go through the process a little bit of constructing one from scratch, just because it's going to help us understand what is inside of these SF objects that we're importing and then analyzing. So the main component of an SF object is the fact that we have a data frame with a special column, a geometry list column. So if I want to create an SF object, I first need to create that geometry list column. And that geometry list column is made up of each entry is a different geometry object. So in this first example, we're going to create a geometry list of points. So each geometry object in my list is going to be a different point. So in this case, I've got 3 points in my SF object. I've got a point at 0, 0, 0, 1, and 1, 1. So I'm going to define each of those as a geometry point using the st underscore point function, and then assign those each to point 1, point 2, and point 3. PT1, PT2, PT3. Then I create SFC. I didn't mention this, excuse me, that the main function that we need to create a geometry list column is this function, which is st underscore SFC. So the process, which I kind of skipped over, which is bolted up here, is we first create each geometry object using these old, or not old, but previous functions that we've worked with, st underscore point, st underscore polygon, line string, whatever. We create our objects first, and then we're going to join all of those objects together into a list. And then we're going to convert that list to a geometry list column using the st underscore SFC. That last C stands for column. So this is our geometry list column in the SF object. So that's really the key component to this SF object. Then I've got my geometry list column where each element is a different geometry object. Then I can merge that together with a data frame that has all of the attributes for each of the objects in our geometry list column. So in this case, I'm going to have variables that each have three observations corresponding to each of the 3 points in my geometry list column. So we merge our geometry list column with data, which is stored in a data frame using an st underscore sf function for creating the simple feature. So we've got one function now, sfc, which is going to create the geometry list column. And then after we do that, we merge that with some data using the st underscore sf function. And I just want to point out that as we're working with these different objects, one thing that's nice about working in RStudio that we didn't see with Colab is that we have this environment panel up here. So as I am creating all of these different objects in previous code cells, it's keeping track of what I've created, what has been assigned to these different objects. So you can get some nice information about those in this pane over here. But I will kind of resize this down so that we're looking at our Quarto file in the main window here. Okay, so back to our code. We've got the st underscore point that's defining our 3 points that I talked about earlier. Then we combine those points together into a list. And so that geometry list column is a list. In this case, that list, it contains each element in that list is a point, is an SF point, a geometry point. We're going to then input that list into the SFC, the st underscore SFC function that converts that list to a geometry list column. So let me run this first code cell to create all of that. And then the output is going to be a test to see what type of object that geometry list column is. Is it a list? And here we can see that we've created this geometry list column and it is a list. Okay, so it's not a vector, this is a list. So it's a more complicated structure because each element in this list is a geometry object itself. And we can check the class of that geometry list column, which tells us this is an SFC. This is a geometry list column. So it's a very special type of list. And each of the geometry objects in that column is a point. So that's what that is indicating to me. So from that class function, I can see this is a very special list, a geometry list column. And moreover, that column, each object is a point. Now I need some data. So that gives me my geometry objects. And for each of those points, I'm going to associate some variables. So I'm going to just make up 2 variables, temperature and rainfall. And we're going to have 3 values in each of these vectors because we want to assign a value to each geometry object. We had 3 points. So I'm just going to make up some data. And let's say we've got 3 temperature recordings. At 0, 0, it's 10. At 0, 1, it's 11. And at 1, 1, the temperature is 10.4. And then we'll also think about rainfall. We'll assign, say, 1 inch of rainfall to the point at 0, 0, 1.3 at 0, 1, and we'll assign rainfall of 0.9 to the 3rd point in our geometry list column, which was the point at 1, 1. So that's my data. I just made it up, but now we've got some attributes. And then we merge our data and our geometry list column using the st underscore sf function. So the first thing I input is my data, which is stored in df1. Then I enter my geometry list column, and I'm going to assign this to a column with the name geometry. So you can call this whatever you like. I'm going to call it geometry just because this is the kind of default name that's given to the geometry list column when you're working with most shape files. So that's the kind of most common name to give the geometry list column. So I kind of merge the data and the geometry list column together with this st underscore sf function, and I assign that to sf1. And this is now a sf object. We have a column of geometry objects, and then we have data. We have attributes. And so together that makes an sf object. And let's check the class of this SF object, and we can see that it does have this data frame structure. In addition, it's denoting that this is a simple feature. So it has some additional structure on top of the data frame